Nessa found herself wandering the tiered docks of sunny Hera with a bright smile on her face. Without the ever so dramatically timed rains of Queen's Edge to mimic her mood, she made her way along the lower pier. Stopping on a small outcropping of wood, the little alchemist looked to her side, resting her scarred hand on the splintered wood of a support beam. Deciding this place was as good as any, she plopped herself down, letting her legs dangle off the edge above the water below. She sat there for a long time, just watching the water ebb and flow back and forth as the sound of the city of scallywags surrounded her. Hundreds upon hundreds of stories carrying on without her. A strange comfort in the forgotten lives held by the faces of strangers she'd never forget. On a scale of dead to the greatest. How are we doing? She asked the city at large, kicking her legs softly. Reaching for a stray pebble on the dock behind her, she clutched it tight. Grunting softly in exertion, she tossed it forwards as hard as she could. With a resounding plunk, it disappeared beneath the gentle waves. All the way down to the bottom it sank, resting there perhaps never to be touched again. Forgotten. Yeah. Figured. Nessa hunched over, resting her elbows on her knees. Nessa of the Crimson Rose. Buried at sea. Corpse fed on by gulls. This is why I can't have anything nice. A set of stumpy feet marched along the docks, the jangling of gold in excess adorning a large red coat that preceded a burning grin on the back of the gnome's head. "That's a little Nessie, I see!" A booming voice called out. She snapped her head up, eyes widening somewhat as vague recognition spun her around. A grey-skinned dwarf stood there, the posture of a pious man mixed with the gallant extravagant dress of a fellow who wanted to show off his ill-gotten gains. Sal? Her green eyes widened, rubbed for good measure. No illusion this time. A grin with twice the boldness of her own stared back at her, with his hands on his hips. "None around with a smile so heavily laden with purpose for you, young lass?" He folded his arms as he stepped closer, standing behind where she sat. "Looking far too down for the shining star of Anspool." She let out a soft scoff as she looked down at herself, a tired smile resting on her lips. "Nah, I'm just whinging. I missed you, Sal." She straightened her back up, resting her weight on her palms. "Been busy." "As have I, Nessie. Seems we both had a change of employer." Sal pat her on the back with a big meaty hand. "Fuck. You still show affection like a damn bull. I got small bones, you know." She let out a soft laugh as his cheer forced its way into her clouded mind. "Yeah, I really have." "You're not still with the, She trailed off, giving him a knowing glance. "No, no. I've found a much better paying employer." He folded his arms, resting a shoulder against the support beam as he leaned against it. "You're living among the dead now?" "Oh, nah. Just here for a spell. Only arrived about a month ago aboard Sirac's old ship. Remember him?" "Lucky you found me, huh?" She gave a small shrug, still feeling his grin on her, but looking back out over the waves. "Lucky indeed." He bared his shining teeth to the coast, a golden canine glinting in the light of Sol. "You want to talk, lass? You look like you want to read me your little book of formula again. You really have that much news?" He let his grin lower to a content smile, knowing the woman too well to attempt to meet her eyes. "No, I talked enough for today. Right now, I just want to lay down in a field for a couple days, pick some herbs, and one glass of cheap red." He finished, tapping the side of his nose in a knowing gesture. "Still take it for the shakes." She lowered her head softly, crossing her legs as she allowed herself to relax just that little bit. Yeah. I hide 'em better, though. I'd have hoped it would have worn off by now. It's been bloody years, lass. Yeah, well, I made it, so I think I'd know. She snapped, a sudden flare of defensive anger that surprised both of them. She quickly shrank from his eyes, turning back to the view before her as her hands clumsily fiddled with each other. When she spoke again, it was barely a whisper. I'm sorry, she muttered like a guilty child. It's all right, girl, Sal said softly, his voice as calm as a choir of angels. Another set of boots thumped up alongside Sal. A gruff-looking human, face clad in a black bit of cloth that hid the lower half of his face. He silently looked between Sal and the gnome, asking one very pointed question with his cold eyes. Sal bowed his head in response, looking back at the unaware gnome. What'd I always tell you? You never need to apologize to me, Nessie. The gods are watching over you, they are. Sal continued, watching the newcomer slowly draw a pistol from within his coat. Thanks, Sal. I guess I'm still a little sensitive about it, Nessa began, her words trailing off as her eavesdropping ears perked up. She could hear it plain as day, the slow, metallic drag of a hammer being cocked, as quietly as possible. Her fidgeting hands clammed up as her whole body was gripped by fear for a moment. 1,000 different emotions all smacking her at once. A type of pain and terror that would have forced Nessa to hold still and take the bullet in a morbid paralysis had this been her mere weeks ago. In the half-second that she had to process all of this, her left hand found purchase in her belt of vials. The fake mage had no idea what the potion could be, and didn't have time to consider it. Pushing on the bottom of it with her thumb to slide it out of the leather strap, she gripped the crystal container tight and flung it behind herself as hard as she could. The vial smashed against the nearby wall of a building, and a thick, black cloud of smoke erupted out, surrounding the three in an instant. Nessa scrambled to her feet, holding her breath as she heard a shot ring out next to her head. She gripped her ear as the piercing whine screamed at her. Disoriented and terrified, she picked a direction and ran as the two coughed and sputtered in the smoke behind her. As the smog started to clear, carried on by the seaside breeze, the gunman spat his words with a Federation grit. Little shit! Where'd you go? That'd be your job to find out, wouldn't it? Sal coughed out a grinning reply. I'll return to him. Down the good the good news. The gunman glared at the dwarf's smug assurance, before turning his head to hear the wood creak under tiny footsteps on the upper docks above him. Giving a curt nod to the dwarf, he started off after Nessa, not returning the friendly wave of farewell Sal offered behind him. Nessa's legs burned as she sprinted onwards, panicked eyes darting about as she searched for any face she recognized, anyone she could hide behind. Plucking a tried and tested potion from her repertoire, she chugged the horrid brown sludge that was bark skin. As the potion went to work, her skin turned a wooden brown, lumping together and cracking like the aged bark of an old oak tree. Panting heavily, she looked down towards her vial belt as she continued onwards along the tiered docks of Hera's east side, praying she had some other vials loaded in. Seeing only one other, she started to pull it out as another shot rang out. The bullet ripped into her tiny shoulder, the force of the impact sending her staggering to the ground. Crashing against the wood hard and rolling from the force, as the vial slid from her hands, around the corner of a building and into an alley. Her head struck the very same corner, bursting her brow and sending her vision into a blurry daze. Carried on by a mix of adrenaline, frantic willpower, and alchemical alterations, she crawled hastily into the alley after her potion, hearing the hate-filled words of her pursuer. "Found you, you slippery little fuck!" he called as another shot struck the edge of the building, just behind her leg. Among the ringing whine of the lingering gunshot, Her sensitive ears still managed to pick up the approaching footfalls of her attacker, thundering like the drums of the apocalypse themselves. The little alchemist looked to the potion and, in an adrenaline-filled haste for time she didn't have, swung her fist down onto the crystal. She smashed the vial of burning hands and coated her fist in its wax-like contents in the process, but not without getting shards of the vial stuck in her skin. She crawled a few inches further into the alley, the searing pain from her bleeding shoulder spiking with every movement as the bullet wedged itself further into her flesh. She practically dragged herself behind a crate for a moment of prolonged safety. Nessa brought her hands together, snapping her fingers next to her hand coated in a strange melted wax-like substance. The flint pieces sewn into her gloves struck against one another, sparking a bit but not catching. She snapped again. Once more, nothing. The gnome felt the thumping boots of the gunman approach, in sync with every fifth beat of her pounding heart. As he rounded the edge of the crate, Nessa's final snap sparked, the flame catching along her palm. The substance all ignited at once, coating her hand in a burning flame that left her unscathed. "Hold still, you miserable little," he began as he leveled the pistol at her. Acting now or never, Nessa lunged forward with all the energy she had left, grabbing at whatever she could on the man with her burning hand. Due to his own arrogance in having bent down to taunt the cornered gnome, Nessa managed to slam her hand against his face, gripping it as hard as she could to mush the flames and shattered crystal shards into it. He let out a cry of shock and pain as the bandana around his mouth was burned into his flesh along with the grubby handprint from his once target. Once the initial shock of pain passed, the gunman jerked his arm across himself, bashing the young woman across her face with the grip of his pistol, and knocking her arm away from him. She was almost thrown to the side by the blow, but still focused as every fibre of her being shifted from flight to fight. She threw her burning hand towards him, this time grabbing around his gun arm as he went for another swing at her. Her lashing hand caught his wrist, the flames forcing his hands to seize up and drop the pistol to rip it away from her. Roaring in pain through gritted teeth, he swung his foot forwards to kick the woman back into the planks. "Worthless little freak!" He spat down to pull a holdout knife from his boot. "I'm gonna fucking gut you!" Nessa felt another wave of panic shoot through her body as she found herself on her hands and knees again, letting out a hacking cough from the resulting blow to her gut. She started crawling again, just attempting to get away from the man who stomped closer. Her eyes locked onto it. His pistol. Pushing forward, beyond her limits from the short scrap. Through pain, terror, and anguish, she dragged the very world under her hands, legs carried limply behind. She reached out for the weapon, fingers so tantalizingly close. "No, you fucking don't!" The man barked, grabbing her by the ankle and reefing her closer to him. She was dragged suddenly along the splintered planks. Nessa rolled onto her back and swung her free leg up wildly at the human. Her foot struck his burned hand as it gripped around her other ankle, drawing another roar of pain from the assailant and forcing him to drop her. He swung his blade in response, slashing the gnome along her shin as her leg recoiled. Pushing herself away with her elbows and feet to avoid another slash, Nessa sent one last hopeful attempt behind her with a flaming hand. The gunman reeled his arm back to lunge forward and plunge his blade into the woman's heart. But as he stepped closer, the gnome felt her hand come into contact with something metal. She gripped it tight and pulled it to her chest, one of her grubby fingers finding the quickly heating metal of the trigger, and squeezing it as hard as she could with her eyes tightly shut. The shot rang out. A singular bang that froze Nessa solid, as the kick from the gun blew itself out of her hands. It clattered across the wood behind her. The alchemist kept her eyes shut for a moment, as her ears continued to ring, awaiting the searing pain of unforgiving steel plunging into her gut. Instead, she felt the planks she lay on quake as a body hit the floor. Her eye cracked open, staring at the smoking gun and upturned boot of the laying man. Nessa's eye twitched, the reality of her actions settling into a pit in her stomach, as her eyes burned the man's twitching, bloody face into her memory. The powerful pistol at this close of a range had half blown the man's face off. The mess of gore and bone, scattered brain matter and burnt flesh that was the face of someone she once knew, even in passing, etched itself onto her soul with a burning quill. A memory that would haunt her to the end of her days. It came first as a short exhale of breath, a quick push to empty her lungs entirely, then a deep breath in to ready her throat, and finally a loud, piercing scream as Nessa cried out in horror. Frantically, she began to hyperventilate and kicked her feet against the wood, scrambling her wounded body back away from the corpse as it shook and twitched in the throes of death. Her back thumped into a crate behind her as she ran out of space to flee from her own sin, hugging her knees close to her chest as the screaming pain in the hole of her shoulder blade sparked up with every strain of the muscle. Nessa continued to break down. She tucked her head downwards, wide eyes staring at shaking hands as the flames that coated her fist died out. The fake mage started to gently rock herself back and forth, muttering incoherent words in Gnomish as tears streamed down her cheeks. The bleeding, the pain, the self-preservation fueled frenzy, it all disintegrated in her mind as all she could focus on was the life she had just taken. Her stomach churned, a burning in her throat that she recognized signaling her to move. She threw her weight to one side, doubling over sideways to involuntarily spill her guts onto the ground. The sickening taste and sight of her own bile barely even registered as she weakly dragged the back of her hand across her chin and slumped back against the crate. With the earlier potion now among her last meal on the docks, Nessa's skin slowly started going back to its normal shade, if a bit paler. But with it came the no longer numb sensations of the pain that rocked her body. Clenching her teeth tight, she rested her back against the crate, attempting to look anywhere but the corpse. Unsure of what to do next, she did the only thing her body could decide on. She sucked in a haggard breath, the air coming in waves between hicks and sobs of her ongoing outburst, and then let it out, equally as shaken. "Who the fuck was shooting over there?" a slimy voice shouted. Nessa knew one of the Feral's men when she heard one. There was no way she could handle the Fanged Queen. Not now. Her body screamed at her, absolutely refusing to let them get this far and stop. The alchemist gripped at the edges of the box, running on little more than willpower at this point. Clawing her way to her feet, Nessa steadied herself on the crate and attempted to orientate herself. Picking any direction but the way she came, she pushed off of the box and settled into a staggered run further into the city, hitting into walls as she came to turns, grabbing onto anything her height for support. She pushed herself beyond any limit her body could handle, leaving a trail of blood and tears. The gnome's mind shut down completely as she was carried onwards back towards the Crimson Rose, or as close as she could get to it before her body gave out.